A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Does the Rabbi have some thoughts regarding Yom Yerushalayim?
I do indeed have some thoughts that I would like to share with you. Namely, the fact that every year around this time, just leading up to Yom Yerushalayim, Yom Yerushalayim, we should say, the day of the liberation of Yerushalayim from foreign rule, I always find myself grieving over the fact that the vast majority of Israel's citizenry, and the vast majority of the Jews around the world for that matter, largely ignore this very important day of Yom Yerushalayim, which is celebrated on Kaf Het B'Iyar, the 28th of Iyar. Here in Israel, there are two camps that are largely responsible for this state of affairs. First of all, we have the left-leaning or outright leftist secular establishment of the State of Israel. When I say establishment, I refer to all forms of power and influence as they exist in the present day in Israel, such as in the political sphere, in journalism, in the media, in the justice and the legal system, in all very many levels of government and bureaucratic institutions in the country. All these bodies which go up to make the establishment with a capital E have, over the last many years, ever since the Six-Day War, which is now some 47 years ago, they have gone out of their way to ensure that the vast majority of the people in Israel, to begin with, largely ignore this day and know very little about it, and it was never made into a public holiday, for example, as Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, which I prefer to refer to as Yom Tekumat Yisrael, and it's not stressed in the educational system of the mainstream school systems in the country, and therefore the day and the entire message and the collective recollection of the events of the Six-Day War, and what we should recall and what we should think about those events, and how we should appreciate what happened and understand what happened, also understand what did not happen. All this is unfortunately lost, and the reason for the Israeli left acting in such a way is very obvious. Any connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem, particularly the old city of Jerusalem, and even more particularly Harabait, the Temple Mount, and any mention of the Mikdash, of the temple, etc., etc., any such mention, any idea, any association with these ideas and these facts, these realities, are anathema to the Israeli left, because they serve to remind people that really we have a long way to go, and the state of Israel is still without its true heart and soul, that is to say Harabait and the old city of Yerushalayim. The Atikah of Yerushalayim is in our hands in many ways, but not as it should be. The Arabs and other enemies of the Jewish people still are able to behave in ways which we should not be willing to stand for. But more particularly, Har HaBayit is essentially extraterritorial. It is not essentially part of Israel. The Israeli establishment, again the leftist Israeli establishment, quite deliberately, immediately after the Six-Day War, handed over Har HaBayit to the Arabs, to the so-called Muslim Supreme Council, the Waqf, and basically washed their hands of Har HaBayit. And to this day, the Israeli authorities enforce a very unique form of apartheid policy with regards to Har HaBayit, whereby religious Jews, and only religious Jews, anyone who seems by his outward appearance and attire perhaps to be a religious Jew, is singled out for very special treatment. And from that day to this, from the Six-Day War to the present day, Jews are banned from praying on Har HaBayit. There is no law in Israel that prevents Jews from doing so. In fact, there is a law that states the opposite. There is the law regarding the holy places, Chok HaMekomot HaMekudashim in Hebrew, which guarantees the right of worship to all members of all faiths in all their holy sites. One would imagine this would include Har HaBayit for Jews, but apparently it does not. And the reasons given for this are various and usually not extremely convincing. One of the reasons given for this ban on a Jewish presence on Har HaBayit has to do with a primordial fear that the Israeli left has vis-a-vis the Muslim world, that if Jews are allowed to be found on Har HaBayit, and certainly if they're allowed to pray on Har HaBayit in any way, shape or form, then this will cause an international, worldwide uprising of the Islamic nation against the Jewish people. Something which I categorically deny would happen. This is entirely a self-inflicted psychosis, which we need to discuss on another occasion. But in general, the fact of the matter is the Israeli left wants as little to do with Yerushalayim and also the Six-Day War as possible, because the Six-Day War also returned to the control and the sovereignty, or at least it should have returned to the full control and full sovereignty of the Jewish people, the heartland of Eretz Yisrael. And this is exactly what the Israeli left does not want to see happen. They do not want Israelis to connect to their true ancient homeland, their heartland, the very cradle of Jewish existence, places like Shechem and Beth El, and of course Yerushalayim, Har HaBayit, Bethlehem, etc., etc. These are all places which simply instill fear in the hearts of the Israeli left, because they're very non-Jewish and in fact even non-Zionist agenda has no room for such elements.
The rabbi mentioned two camps. What is the second group to which you refer?
Interestingly, the other camp, which in practical terms has a very similar agenda of denying the existence of this day, Yom Yerushalayim, and downplaying it, sidelining it, belittling it, and even ridiculing it, surprisingly, is the Haredi world, the so-called ultra-Orthodox religious world. Has religiously, one could say, ignored this day of Yom Yerushalayim. This is certainly true by and large, although I can tell you parenthetically, and this is, I think, an interesting aside, that in Tel Shin Mem Beth 1982, I in the summer, around this time of year in fact, the end of Iyar, beginning of Siwan, I visited a certain very great scholar, Talmid Chachamim, in Bnei Brak by the name of Harav Sraya Divlitsky. And he is certainly Haredi, self-described Haredi, he lives in Bnei Brak, But he's also a somewhat independent thinker and also independent doer even on occasions. And he said to me in this conversation when I visited him in his home that he himself does say Hallel on Yom Yerushalayim, which I did not know. I had not known this prior to that conversation. I asked him, did he say it at night or in the morning? He said no, only in the morning, which I also, by the way, believe to be the correct psak halacha, that Hallel should only be said during the day. And I asked him if he says it with a bracha or not. He says no, he says without a bracha. And then I asked him, all right, and do you say Hallel also on Yom HaAtzmaut? And he said no. And when I asked him why not, or what the difference was between one day and the other, Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, frankly, he was hard put to fully explain his position. He says some words to the effect that Yerushalayim is special, something like that, but it wasn't a very clear or cogent argument. But Rav Divlitsky and some others like him are admittedly the exception in the Haredi world rather than the rule. I can also mention something else that I learned many years ago from an acquaintance, a Haredi acquaintance, a person older than myself who began learning in the Yeshivat Kol Torah, the yeshiva in which Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal was the Rosh Yeshiva for decades. And he arrived in that yeshiva in Tashin Kavhet, 1968, in other words, approximately a year after the Six-Day War. And he told me that in that year, and also at least for a couple of years following that, he couldn't remember exactly how many years, but he did recall there was more than 1 year, on Kavhet Be'iyar, Yom Yerushalayim, the yeshiva would daven minha early, or perhaps the usual time, I'm not quite sure, about 1:30 or something like that. And then the Hadar Ochel, the dining hall, was laid out as it was laid out and set up for Shabbat. In other words, in a more festive atmosphere and manner. And they had a special Shabbat-like meal instead of the regular lunch. And then the entire yeshiva went to the Ir Atikah to dance at the Kotel. This is Yeshivat Kol Torah, which is, of course, a Haredi yeshiva in Beit Vegan in Yerushalayim. This was apparently done for a number of years until, at some point, for some reason, or one can imagine the reason, and by whom I'm not sure, but this practice was put to a stop. So I've also heard that in Yeshivat Mir, in Mea She'arim, in the first year or two after Milchemet Sheshet Yamim, they said Hallel. I'm imagining, I'm guessing here, I didn't hear this explicitly, without a bracha, but they said Hallel in Yeshivat Mir on Yom Yerushalayim, but this also did not last for very long. So yes, there were certain groups, certain camps, certain chachamim, and certain yeshivot even in the Haredi world that did feel the need to recognize and celebrate this day and to thank HaShem for what happened. But this very quickly was overtaken by the political and ideological agenda of the more extreme elements in the Haredi world, who have, since that time and down to the present day, have essentially taken over, and their voices are the only voices really that are heard in the Haredi world. And the net result of the actions of these two camps, both the secular leftist camp in Israel and the Haredi camp, which, by the way, it should be said, which intuitively is right-leaning and not at all leftist in its essential, visceral feelings and leanings. Nevertheless, the net result of these two groups has been to entirely, almost entirely, perhaps one could say, remove Yom Yerushalayim, Yom Shichru Yerushalayim from the consciousness of the Jewish people, both in Israel and overseas. And this is a tremendous tragedy, because there is much that the Jewish people must know and must learn and must remember about the Six-Day War, which unfortunately is not nearly as well known as one would imagine that it would be.
What do the Jewish people need to know regarding the Six-Day War?
What we all need to know regarding Mechanat Sheshet Amim is that event, that historical event that took place in only 6 days, was the single greatest event in Jewish history from the time of David HaMelech, if not perhaps even including the time of David HaMelech. I do not know if even in the days of David HaMelech there was a campaign, a 6-day campaign, in which the Jewish people conquered so much of their God-given territory. I do not know if in the time of David HaMelech there was a war that changed the direction of Jewish history and Jewish destiny as did the Six-Day War. Many people do not recall that Israel was an extremely small, narrow, indefensible country, and lived in that state and existed in that state for 19 years, from Tafshin Heth 1948 to Tafshin Kav Zayin 1967. The famous Auschwitz borders, as Abba Eben chose to describe them quite correctly, quite accurately. And it's also relevant to point out that the heartland of the Jewish people, the heartland of Eretz Yisrael, was not part of the original political entity known as the State of Israel. The Six-Day War changed all of that. It more than doubled the area of the Jewish state. I'm referring, of course, at this point to all the area that was regained at that time, including the Sinai, the Golan, Yudah and Shomron, etc. It changed the security situation. It completely. It struck the entire world dumb, frankly, and the Arab world was in shock and essentially dysfunctional for some time after that. And it opened up tremendous possibilities, unbelievable, undreamt of possibilities for the Jewish people. The correct thing, of course, for us to have done immediately after Mechanat Sheshet Amim, and had this been done immediately after that war by an Israeli government that actually knew what it wanted and understood why it wanted it, this would have been doable without too much difficulty, and the world would simply have accepted it as a perfectly normal and reasonable conclusion to that war. And what we should have done was to annex all those territories, encourage the emigration of our enemies from our land, and create a strong, vibrant country throughout all those parts of Eretz Yisrael that were then, following the Six-Day War, that were now in our hands. Instead, of course, we know what happened. The disasters began with the government led by Moshe Dayan in this case, returning Harabait, or one should say perhaps relinquishing Harabait to the hands of the Muslims, the Arabs. It's also relevant to point out here that Dr. Mordechai Kedar, a highly respected Orientalist and Arabist, has officially stated on more than one occasion that he heard from two reliable sources on two different occasions, two people who had no connection one to the other, that one of the reasons Moshe Dayan did so, I'm not saying this is the only reason, he's not claiming this either, but one of the reasons Moshe Dayan did so was because, as is well known, he himself was an avid amateur archaeologist. He was also a well-documented archaeological thief. He stole tremendous numbers of archaeological finds that were found in the country and kept them in his own private museum in his backyard, quite literally. And this was well known. Of course, nothing was ever done. No one was ever prosecuted, although it's entirely illegal. And part of the deal, which was not written, an oral agreement between himself and the Waqf, the Muslim council in charge, that claims to be in charge and have the rights to Harabait, was that he will give it over to them, and they will allow him on a private basis to excavate certain areas on Harabait and keep whatever he finds there. He, of course, returned Harabait to the Arabs, and he, on the other hand, he was never allowed to excavate anything at all, which, knowing Arabs and our enemies as they are, should not surprise anyone. That is a fact of which I became only recently aware, but is well attested by very reliable sources who knew this firsthand. So I return to the point. The main point is that the next thing the Israeli government of that time, which was of course totally confused and entirely out of its depth, unable to deal with this phenomenal set of miracles, one miracle upon the other, that resulted in the most outstanding and most miraculous military victory, perhaps in human history, but certainly in living memory. What we did instead was basically throw it back into Hashem's face. The Israeli government of that time, led by the Labour Party, stated that we want to use these territories as bargaining chips in order to achieve some kind of a peace agreement with the Arabs, and the rest, unfortunately, is history. It's also true that we could and we should mention the fact that other people tried to do other things and did succeed in doing many other things in the opposite, pulling the Jewish people in the opposite direction, that is to say, Gush Emunim, the settlement movement, which over a period of decades has succeeded in bringing roughly 400,000 Jews to reside in parts of those areas that were liberated in Tafshin Kav Zayin, 1967, and that this has also changed the reality completely. This also took place and continues apace. And this is something we should also not forget. But our point now, the point I'm driving at right now, is that this day and the war that this day represents, this day of Yom Yerushalayim, and the war and the miraculous nature of that victory have been totally overlooked. I recently attended a lecture given by Dr. Hagi Ben Artzi, an historian, regarding the Six-Day War. He himself recently wrote a booklet called Megillat Sheshet Hayamim, which is basically a factual record of the miraculous nature of the war. And one of the things he mentioned was that the entire Israeli strategy was based on a preemptive airstrike against the Arab air forces, particularly the Egyptian Air Force. And this took place and was wildly successful, beyond the wildest dreams of all the Israeli generals and military planners. The plan called for the Israeli Air Force to fly very low down south along the Mediterranean towards Egypt, and then break up into different groups and attack simultaneously 26 airfields and destroy, in theory, and eventually also in practice, this is what happened, destroy in minutes the vast majority of the the Egyptian Air Force. The problem was that the Egyptians knew very well of this plan. This plan had been written down and had been discussed and had been part of the essential training of the Israeli Air Force for years, had been focused on this one surprise preemptive attack, which the Egyptians knew all about and were well prepared for. And they had patrols of planes patrolling their airspace precisely on the day and the days preceding and the day on which the attack took place, which of course was a preemptive attack to prevent the promised and imminent attack of a number of Arab armies on the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. And by all accounts, it would have been almost impossible to achieve surprise. And yet what happened in practice was that on that day, at that time, at 7:20 in the morning, the Egyptian patrol that was supposed to take off and monitor the Mediterranean Sea in that area to be aware and to have sufficient time to warn the rest of the Egyptian Air Force of the Israeli attack is imminent and they should get into the air, etc. That they had around the clock patrols, and one patrol went down, landed at 7:20. The other was supposed to take off at 7:20 in the morning, but it did not. And the reason it did not, I did not know until I heard this lecture. The reason is as follows, writes Dr. Hagi Ben Altzi, and this book is thoroughly referenced and very well documented. The story is as follows. The head of the Egyptian Air Force was so confident of the imminent victory of the Egyptian army over the Israelis and the imminent destruction of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, that even before the war had taken place, that is to say the night before the surprise and preemptive Israeli attack, he invited all squadron leaders, etc., in the Air Force to a big party in which much alcohol was imbibed, not according to the laws of Islam, as we know, and then sent them all home to their beds, but rather late. And the squadron leader, who was supposed to take off with his planes to fly the patrol that was scheduled to take off at 7:20, slept in. Quite literally, he slept in. He did not hear the alarm clock because he had drunk a lot the night before, and he woke up late. And when he was raised on the phone at about 7:30, and he was asked, "Where are you? Why aren't you in the air?" His planes were on the tarmac waiting. Their engines were running, but he had to join them. He was a squadron leader. They couldn't take off without him. And he, of course, mumbled something on the phone to the general who called and said, I was held up, I'm sorry, I'll be there in a minute. Anyhow, he eventually got to his plane. They just began to take off, but by that time it was 7:45. And at 7:45 exactly, as planned, the surprise preemptive strike took place on all 26 air bases, and almost the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed in literally in half an hour. And from that moment on, there was no chance that the Arab armies would be successful, and it was almost guaranteed that Israel would succeed. But even that did not guarantee the tremendous successes that took place over the coming days. For 6 days, each day there were strings of miracles and victories and completely inexplicable events that allowed the Israeli forces to advance with very few casualties. All this is documented in Megillat Sheshet Hayamim, written by Dr. Hagi Ben Altzi, and these are the kinds of things that the Jewish people should know and should be aware of. And unfortunately, these things have been deliberately hidden from their view, so as not to remind them that such victories can only take place when HASHEM, Elohei Yisrael, is behind us. And this is exactly what happened, and this is what we should know and we should be aware of, and we should remind ourselves every year by celebrating and by doing something about this day. And this day of Yom Yerushalayim, therefore, on Kaf Het B'Iyar, which serves to commemorate the entire war, not just that day, is something very important and should be a very important day on the calendar. However, instead of this, what we find, for example, in the Haredi world, as we mentioned before, this day is not only not celebrated and not noted, it is in fact ridiculed. In fact, I can show you what I found in my mailbox this morning. This is a widely circulated free Haredi newspaper, which, as you can see, is called Merkaz HaInyanim. And here on the front page, it says Yom Yerushalayim, and the headline reads, and I read it, Yom Yerushalayim Yitzuyan B'Yom Revi'i, Aval Yom Yerushalayim HaMashma'uti Yihiyeh B'Yud-Bet Be'elul. The important Yom Yerushalayim will not be now this week, but will be on Yud-Bet Be'elul. It goes on to explain what it's talking about on page 12. And what is the great event that is going to take place on Yud Bet Be'elul this year and several months hence? The great event will be the elections for the chief rabbi or chief rabbis of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. As it says here, you can see quite plainly the different players. Some of them here are photographed, and what it describes here in this piece of what I must regretfully refer to as gutter journalism, what it explains in this little piece is that all the politics and machinations and underhanded tactics and dealings of the different camps that are jockeying for position in order to get one of their people, one of their men, one of their boys, if you like, into these positions that are so coveted for some reason. For example, a certain Rav who is not Haredi, although he wears a black kippah, he is a student, or now a man almost 70 years old, but he a student for many years back, decades back, of Yishvat Mekaz Harav, called Harav Aryeh Stern, someone I've met and I know personally, and it would probably be a rather appropriate choice for the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He will, in a few months, not very many months' time, turn 70. And for those who don't know, I should mention here that the chief rabbinate of Jerusalem has been vacant. The two positions, both Sephardi and Ashkenazi, have been vacant for over 10 years. It would appear, by the way, that these positions are not absolutely crucial or essential. The things seem to have been running quite nicely without having any chief rabbi in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, one of the reasons that the elections have not taken place for over 10 years is because the Haredi camp knew that Rabbi Aryeh Stern, who is not of their own camp, had a rather good chance of winning such an election and becoming the chief rabbi, and they did not want this. So they have for years now employed delaying tactics to push off the elections time and again, year after year. This has been done with, I must admit, with great political talent and finesse, so that the elections would not take place before Rabbi Aryeh Stern turned 70. And why, you ask, what's so important about that? Because the law states, for whatever reason, that a person who is already 70 years of age cannot be elected to a position such as Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem or Chief Rabbi of Israel, etc. These kinds of underhanded tactics and all the other political considerations and concerns that are detailed in that article, that, according to this Haredi newspaper, is the real Yom Yerushalayim that we should be celebrating, that we should be so excited about, that we should all find so moving, edifying and enlightening, and not Yom Shilo Yerushalayim B'Chavhet B'Iyar. And frankly, I cannot think of a more damning condemnation of the Haredi view of the world and of Judaism than that.
But Rabbi, in all fairness, isn't the choice of chief rabbi of Jerusalem a very important matter?
Is it? I challenge you or anybody to mention even one important action or decision taken by a chief rabbi of Jerusalem ever, certainly in living memory. I cannot recall any such action or decision taken by any chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Ashkenazi or Sephardi, for decades, and perhaps never at all. And therefore I would reject that contention completely. It's not important at all. What's important is to break the hold of the rabbinical establishment here in Israel, which is by and large of a Haredi persuasion, to break the hold of that rabbinical establishment, which has only one goal in its sights and is able to focus on one thing and one thing only, and that is to maintain the Jewish halachic, ideological, spiritual status quo that existed in the Galut, in the exile, which means that all Jews must view themselves as being Sfaradim or Ashkenazim or Hungarian Jews or Moroccan Jews, etc. And they have to follow the Piskei Halacha based on what their great-great-grandfathers did 180 years ago, etc., and maintain this kind of fractured and directionless existence from now and forevermore. That is the sole direction and the only true purpose of the rabbinical establishment in Israel, which serves only to hold the Jewish people back rather than move them forward. And therefore I see no value and no importance whatever to the established rabbinate here in Israel as it exists at the present time.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.